Hey, real quick, this video is part of my 12 days of Christmas celebration. And basically, to celebrate the fact that I've been on YouTube for more than a year and the fact that it's Christmas, I'm going to be doing daily videos for a little while so that you guys can enjoy that. However, I also want this to be a bit of a gift for my girlfriend, so I'm going to be not having any of these videos edited so that she can take a break from that for a while. Don't worry, I'm also getting her real gifts. Don't worry about that. After the 12 days of Christmas are over, we're going to take a little bit of a break and come back on January 14th. So look forward to that. Hello Internet, my name is the Golden Stalfos, and today we're going to talk about one of the biggest problems with capitalism by zooming in on an issue that is important but not very talked about, and might be more important than some of the things that do get talked about a lot more. And the topic I want to talk about today is e-waste. Now, a lot of people who are really into computers know about the problem of e-waste and are very concerned about making sure that every new piece of equipment that gets made is reusable, recyclable, etc. But the companies who make that stuff don't really care. And through the lens of capitalism, there's no reason for them to care. So, yeah. So for anyone who isn't in the computer scene, let me quickly lay it out for you. Basically, whenever a computer is made, it's made out of a bunch of hard things, minerals and metals and silicon, and it just doesn't break down very easily, right? Like the computer chip that was in your computer in the 80s is probably still in a landfill, not broken down at all. Of course, that only applies if you're old enough to have lived through the 80s, which, considering the fact they're on YouTube, is statistically unlikely, but that's not the point. The broader point is that, your cell phone has a bunch of stuff in it that doesn't break down and isn't easy to recycle, and when you throw away your cell phone, it will end up in a landfill, and it will fill that space forever. Same thing goes for your PC, your TVs, your monitors, any smart device you ever own. There's a lot of stuff these days that's electronic and therefore not compostable or decomposable or easily to recycle. It's kind of like how you're never supposed to throw away batteries because they have battery acid and that's bad for the environment and you should take them to a proper recycling facility. Well, it's like that, but for literally everything you own that takes electricity. And I'm sure hearing that, you're thinking, man, I own a lot of things that take electricity, from my earphones to my microwave, that's a lot of stuff. And you might then be thinking, wait a minute, that's a lot of people who also have all that other stuff. And a lot of it gets thrown out and replaced every year or two. That's insane. And you're right. According to most reports, e-waste takes up a phenomenal amount of space at landfills, far more than it should, far more than is reasonable for something so new. And this problem is much more far-reaching than you might expect. For example, there are more smartphones in the world than there are toilets. And while smartphones may be the most common device, they're far from the only one. E-waste covers everything from pocket calculators to desktop computers. And the problem of these things being difficult to recycle isn't going away. There are some things we could do to improve the recyclability of our electronics, but it's never going to be perfect, and there's never going to be a way to completely fix that issue. So we need to not just consider how to fix the waste process of the objects we already have, but also how to make sure that the objects we have last longer and don't end up in the waste as frequently. It's also worth noting that electronics aren't just annoying because they take up a lot of space in landfills and don't degrade, but also because they're dangerous. They oftentimes have things like battery acid, capacitors are full of this gook that's bad for the environment, and it's also all very toxic. So if there's a landfill with a bunch of computers in it and those computers do erode enough that all of that gook starts leaking out of them into, say, the water table, that's very dangerous. And that's why it's important that whenever you have a an electronic device with its own motherboard and stuff, that you take it to a proper recycling facility, if possible. However, like I said, recycling and disposal isn't going to fix the problem long term. We also have to reduce the amount of things that end up in landfills. And under capitalism, that's not possible, because under capitalism, there's competition. And as long as there's competition, you have to make a new product so that people will buy your product instead of your opponent. Now, this may sound obvious, but let's just take a comparison here. Okay, so for example, the Nintendo Switch doesn't really have a competitor. There are other game consoles on the market and people play games on PC and stuff, but Nintendo has a monopoly on all their intellectual properties and they're all locked to their own hardware, and so they don't need to make new hardware until they decide it's time for a big upgrade, right? If you want to play Mario, you're playing Mario on the Switch. You don't have any other options, so deal with it. Now, this practice is monopolistic and anti-consumer and really fucked up, but it does help highlight how a lack of competition breeds a lack of e-waste, because the Nintendo Switch that was being produced 7 years ago is still in production today, and if you have one that you got 7 years ago, you still have it. And it still does all the things a Switch is supposed to do. You can still use it to watch Netflix or download new Switch games or whatever. Its internet capabilities aren't limited by the fact that it's an old machine, right? It plays all the games it's supposed to play because that's what it was built to do. And it still has the same hardware that it had 7 years ago. So there's no reason to get a new one if you already have one that works. Now, they did recently launch like a refreshed version of the machine that has a better screen, but it's not like so much better that you need to buy it if you already have a Switch. Like, it's just not that much better. It doesn't have any extra capabilities. It's just slightly prettier. Oh well. Now, in contrast, the PC marketplace. It's true that PCs are built to do a lot more than game consoles are, and that the companies which make PC components largely have to appeal to enthusiasts who want to get like the highest peak performance possible. But let's be real, that's not the only reason they release a new product every year or two. Consider AMD and Intel, right? When AMD wasn't doing anything worthwhile in the CPU space, and Intel was basically the only one on the market, Intel just made a new product when they felt like they had made a meaningful increase, and most of the time, the increase wasn't that big, and they were mostly just releasing a new product for the sake of having a new product out there so people would buy it. And this was something that a lot of tech people complained about. Like, a lot of people were like, it's really annoying that all the cool new stuff is just like 2% better than last year's cool new stuff. That's boring. And as a bit of an enthusiast myself, I am pretty happy that there's now more competition between AMD and Intel, and they're moving up to making actual generational improvements. But here's the thing, most people don't get every new product that comes out. Most people don't replace their CPU every year. Most people don't even replace their CPU every 5 years. I got my rig in 2017, and I haven't run into anything it can't do yet, and I'm not planning to replace anything until at least 2 years from now. I might upgrade the graphics card because the one I got was already old, but also it does the job, so why, The average person will keep their PC for between 5 and 10 years. And the main thing that drives people to upgrade is the fact that Chrome gets really slow because the internet keeps getting more and more bloated with features that you don't need. I mean, think about it this way. If all you do with your computer is edit pictures and write up documents for work, you could be running an XP system. Like there were programs for that on XP. They were pretty good. They did everything you needed and then some. Like, why do you need advanced hardware for Photoshop? Because Adobe keeps adding new and new features to force you to get more advanced hardware, even though these are features you don't really use and don't really need, and like you're just fine with the first version of the software. And I realize that's a little different for professionals who like, work at Pixar or whatever. Like, yeah, if your job is to make cutting edge visuals, then you need cutting edge software and cutting edge hardware, and sure, fine. But for an average person who's just doing it for fun, they don't. They could be served just as well with hardware that's 10 years old and not even notice the difference. Now, granted, when you move from a 10-year-old PC to a new PC, you'll notice a huge increase in speed and access to a bunch of new features, and that's really fun and cool. But you don't really notice that big of a gap if you move from last year's model to this year's model, do you? So why do we make them on an annual cycle? Why don't we make them, every 7 or 10 years like with game consoles, By the time the PS4 came out, no one was saying the PS3 isn't any good. It doesn't even do what I want it to do anymore. No, it did exactly what you wanted it to do. It ran exactly the way it ran when you first got it, because it only does the one thing. And granted, because CPUs are general purpose, they have a lot more stuff going on than with a game console. You use them for a lot more different kinds of things, but they're both little computers in a box. There's nothing that you can do on a PC that you couldn't do on an Xbox if there was software compatibility for that, right? Like if Microsoft lets you install Windows on Xbox, it would just be a PC again, no problem. A little bit low spec compared to modern PCs, but that's fine. So the question becomes, why don't PC manufacturers do this? Why don't they release one thing, sell it for 5 years, and then release something way better, 2 or 3 times better 5 years later, right? That way you actually feel the improvement when you decide to upgrade, and everyone actually upgrades. And the reason they don't do that is because if that was their plan, right? If that was their strategy, what about the people who didn't buy their product when it was new, right? What about the people who bought their product or who weren't in the market that year and only are in the market the next year, right? You might initially think, well, they can just buy the product a year later. It's the same product. There's not a new version. But there's a competitor, right? If Intel decided they're going to release PCs only every 5 years when there's a huge generational improvement to be made, AMD can release moderately improved PCs every single year. And then they can make, comparisons between their system and your system, right? And so if you weren't in the market when Intel first made their first 5-year thing, right? But you're in the market, 3 years into that product cycle. Now AMD has made 3 small levels of improvement, so their thing is better. So why would you get the Intel one when you could have the better one? And of course, the people at Intel know this. They know they can't just stop producing PCs for a year because their competitor won't stop producing PCs for a year. And so both companies have to keep producing marginal increases every year, because otherwise, even though people don't need the marginal increase, even though people who got last year's product aren't going to get this year's product, the people who got a product 3 years ago and are looking to upgrade, or 5 years ago and are looking to upgrade, right? You can't be in the middle, because then you'll get undercut. And if these companies were releasing one new product, that might be okay. That would still be wasteful, but it might be something we could deal with. But they don't release one new product, right? Intel, every time they release a CPU, they release the i9, the i7, the i3, the i5, the K versions of each of those chips, the W versions, the special slim down versions to go into laptops, the low power, like they have so many versions of every single chip. They've got the small cache version and the version that does the special thing for servers, and you literally need a fucking chart to decide which CPU you need, and it's ridiculous. And in order to be cost effective, all of these different versions have to be mass produced. All of them. And, they go through this every year. And they don't stop selling last year's CPU just because this year's CPU is out, because some people can't afford this year's CPU and they want last year's. So at any given time, they have probably 3 years worth of products being manufactured, and they're all being manufactured at scale so they can be cost effective. And that's so goddamn much e-waste. And it's also worth noting that if companies weren't constantly pushing out new hardware, then the companies that make software wouldn't be able to push new features that force people onto new hardware, right? Like Chrome couldn't get bigger and more bloated every year if they knew everyone was using 3-year-old hardware. They'd have to, optimize so that shit runs on 3-year-old hardware. Imagine a world where every computer functions like a game console. You get a new one every 5 to 10 years, and that's the one that exists for that time. You buy it, you use it, and that's it. You don't have to worry about whether or not your computer is going to be up to spec for some new program that comes out, because all the new programs have to be built to the spec of the computer that already exists. And then, at the end of that product's life cycle, you get an upgrade and you feel a big increase in capabilities, and all of the new software that gets made for that platform, and etc. Right? Like, not only would this dramatically simplify manufacturing and programming and basically everything that has to do with computers, but it would also make it so that there's a lot less e-waste, because there's no reason to upgrade on an annual cycle or a semi-annual cycle or whatever, because the next generation isn't going to get here for another 6 years. Deal with it. And we would know when there's going to be a big swell of people switching products, so we can be ready to make sure that the products they're switching from are getting recycled properly. Instead of just having lots of underfunded recycling facilities scattered around the world in places that people can't really get to, you just set up like pop-up areas, collection booths and whatnot in places. And hey, if you're upgrading this year, because this is the year to do it. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't continue to innovate newer, better stuff all the time. We should. But we should only sell that stuff to millions of people when it's enough better that it makes sense to do that. No one cares about a 10% improvement over last generation. People don't want to upgrade until their shit is twice as good as it was, until they can feel the difference. Because let's be real, if there's a 10% improvement, you probably can't fucking tell. But if every year we're able to make a new thing that's 10% better than last year, and every, 5 years, the thing that we release is, at least 50 to 100% better than what it was 5 years ago. And then people notice, right? And then it's worth it. And then we aren't spending every year making more and more stuff that's going to end up in landfills and ruin the environment. But a system like this can't exist under capitalism, because capitalism demands that you compete in order to stay alive. If you don't compete every single time your opponent releases a product, you have to release a product. Otherwise, your company will go bankrupt and you won't be able to release a product later, right? It doesn't even matter if your product is particularly good. If you have to rush it to market just to meet your opponent on their schedule, you will, because otherwise you're doomed. Another great example of this, NVIDIA. NVIDIA doesn't release a new product every single year. They release a new product roughly every 2 to 3 years, because that's about how long it takes for them to make something that's enough better that they think it will be a replacement for the stuff they were selling before, and people will upgrade. And there's not another graphics card manufacturer that releases stuff every year that they have to be worried about. I mean, AMD technically releases graphics cards, but come on. We all know it's not the same. They're fine, but they're not the same. Anyone who's trying to upgrade to get the highest end stuff that they can isn't going to get the AMD stuff, because it's not the highest end stuff they can upgrade to. Even though AMD's graphics cards have made huge leaps in the last couple of years, and the ones they're releasing right now are really good, they still don't compete with NVIDIA's top of the line. So if you're going for top of the line, then there's only one top. And because they lack competition, they don't have to release something every year. They can wait until they've made a big leap and then release. And if every computer part functioned this way, it would be so much better. And this is also kind of the case in situations where new parts aren't like really in competition, like computer coolers, right? Like they make new coolers and come up with new designs all the time, but like it's not as complicated as the PC, and so there's not like a whole lot of reason to choose the newest cooler over the cooler from a couple of years ago, as long as it gets the job done. And so if the one from a couple of years ago still gets the job done, that's the one they still make. And they only really need to make something new and more powerful at cooling when someone releases a new chip that like makes their old cooler not good enough. And that doesn't actually happen all that often. You can still use like basic ass coolers from 6 years ago that just have heat pipes going up to a bunch of fins and slap a fan on either side and you're done. Like those still work. There's a bunch of different versions of them, but they still work. Same thing with like your power supply. Like your power supply is a very important component and it really needs to work in order for anything else to work. But it doesn't like there's not competition for power supplies. Like there are a few different companies that do it, but no one is like there's no marketing for power supplies. Like you just get the one that has enough juice for your system and has a decent rating, because there's a standardized rating system for them, and that's it. And because of that, power supply manufacturers don't have to like compete with each other and make crazy new products all the time. They just, here's our modular unit, here's the version that has 600 watts, the version that has 400 watts, the version that has 1,000 watts, get the one you want or the one that you need for your system. We'll still sell all of the same ones 10 years from now because nothing's changed. And that's fine. That's wonderful. That's so much better, because then you don't like feel the need to replace it and throw it away and fill up a landfill with e-waste. And I know at this point in the video, some people are thinking, okay, so capitalist competition means greater production of unnecessary things that will end up in landfills. But it also means innovation. How do we keep the innovation without keeping all the landfill shit? And, for that matter, some people like the way AMD works versus the way Intel works. They have different architectures and stuff. So like, how do we keep that kind of thing going on if we don't have these companies existing? And the answer is, just because you don't have capitalism doesn't mean you don't have big companies. A lot of people imagine that when people advocate for socialism or communism or whatever, they're advocating for the state taking control of production and stuff. And like, some people are. But most people are rather talking about, the workers having more control than some random billionaire, right? And so like, if you remove NVIDIA's CEO and replace their organizational structure with a worker co-op, they're still NVIDIA. They can still make the same graphics cards. They can still use their architecture and shit. Like, it doesn't stop them from existing in that way. A worker-owned company is still a company, and they can still make the same stuff. But if you turn NVIDIA into a worker co-op and you remove the profit motive, right? So under capitalism, even, worker-owned companies want to make more money because that's how you benefit the workers. But if you take away that motive, right? If you take away the profit motive, you have to replace it with something else. Like, what else? What other reason is there for a company like this to exist? And in the case of a tech company, right, the reason for it to exist is to create innovative new products. So instead of spending a bunch of time and money and whatnot on marketing and distribution and stuff, they would just spend all of their effort on creating the next generation of stuff. And if the workers know that they have 5 years to create the next generation of stuff and that they have control over that as a collective, then not only are they able to steadfastly focus on their goal for a long period of time, but they don't have to worry about a boss breathing down their neck and stressing them out and hindering their productivity. In other words, the company still exists, but it goes from being focused on production to being focused on, innovation. And when they're focused on innovation and they don't have any outside pressures to do anything else, they can innovate a lot more. So, if things are socially controlled and there is no profit motive, then companies can still exist. And you can even still have competition and markets and rise and fall of companies, because production is based on need, right? And people need the best thing. And so if your company doesn't produce the best thing and someone else does, bye. Why do we need you? And you don't need money to make that happen. People, if you have a system where people can just get whatever they need or whatever they want, even for free, just, go down to the store, pick it up, and go home. Like, why would anyone pick up the worst thing when they could just pick up the better thing? And then if no one is picking up your thing, then you have to change how you're doing it. Otherwise, you're not being beneficial to society, therefore should be dismantled. So you can still have diverse products, you can still have all your favorite name brands. They just would be run by workers and dedicated toward making the best thing possible instead of making the thing that, they can market the best. And you could introduce some sort of regulations to make sure that, they only release a new product every 5 years so that we don't fucking make so goddamn much e-waste. I mean, I know a lot of socialists and communists will be mad about hearing that last part about regulating things, but because they don't think the state should exist. But if the state is made of the citizenry, the way a company is made of its workers, then yes, it should. Obviously, states like we have now should not exist. They are evil and corrupt and exist to crush the spirit of the average person. But if it was organized better, if it was organized around the people, for the people, of the people, then yeah, the state should exist in that scenario, because then it would be a good thing. So yeah, that's just one of the ways in which capitalism is destroying the environment, and a way that it could easily be solved by a non-capitalist system. But, anyway, thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next life. Laters. Hey, Endcard here. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Seriously though, please subscribe. I have no subscribers. It's sad. If you want to find me on other social media stuff, you can do that at the Golden Stalfos on basically everything. Links to that are in the description, as well as to some charities I like but am obviously not affiliated with. I also have a Patreon if you like me so much that you want to give me money. Though obviously only do that if you have money to burn. And if you do have money to burn, they're the charities I mentioned before. They probably need it more than I do. Mad ups to my girlfriend for doing all the editing for these videos. It's a really big help. Oh, and I occasionally stream on Twitch, so follow me there so you don't miss it. I don't have a formal schedule because when I tried to have a formal schedule, I couldn't keep to it. So, oh well. Okay, thanks. Bye.